I'm a big fan of smaller handhelds, and specifically the Game Boy vertical form factor. When TrimUI announced the TrimUI Brick, I was cautiously optimistic. To be honest, I had no interest in the TrimUI Smart Pro, their horizontal form factor. It has a nice big screen and pretty good build quality, but I just felt like it wasn't powerful enough to match its form factor. I don't need a widescreen, dual analog stick device for a quick round of Tetris or to make some progression in Pokemon. The TrimUI Brick seems like it has an opportunity to take all of the great things about the Smart Pro and squish it into something that makes a bit more sense with the games you would actually want to play on this device. The TrimUI Brick has a striking resemblance to a device that I also love, the Analogue Pocket, and that really gives it a chance to become my new favorite throw-in-your-bag handheld, and it might become yours too. It's got branding in similar places, and it even has that uniquely distinct tealish power button. There's also easy comparisons to make against the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus. It's just about the same size as the Miyoo Mini Plus, and at least to me, it feels as fun and well designed as the Miyoo Mini, but there's also some distinct differences. The TrimUI Brick has an incredibly pixel-dense 3.2-inch 1024 by 768 IPS screen. This is slightly smaller than the 3.5-inch screen on the Miyoo Mini Plus, but it has a dramatically higher resolution. In general, the smaller screen actually lets the controls sit a bit higher on the device, and that makes it so much better for ergonomics, at least for me. Which, while we're on the topic of the controls, let's talk about them. They are absolutely great. All of the buttons are micro switches, but they're pretty quiet. The D-pad feels great and feels very responsive. Each directional press feels intentional. The ABXY buttons have short travel, are kind of low profile, and feel fantastic also. On the face of the TrimUI Brick, we have these two function buttons that also have RGB in them. We have stereo front-firing speakers, and next to the function button, we have start and select. The back of the device has our triggers. They feel good and they're easy to press, and the way that I naturally hold the device, my fingers actually sit really well on the triggers. The triggers actually have a pretty cool feature. They're detachable. In the box of the TrimUI Brick, we actually get a bunch of different variations. We get transparent versions and other styles of triggers to choose from. In total, including the ones already attached to the TrimUI, we get 6 different options for both look and feel for the triggers. The triggers are incredibly easy to pop off, and you can slot on the new ones. I really like the concept of this, and I like to see that TrimUI is thinking of new ways to give us more customization over our devices. On the back of the device, between each set of triggers, there's actually a USB-C port. This is not where you charge the device though. This is strictly to transfer ROMs. So if you want to plug in a drive here, you can transfer games all within the device. The back of the device also has this metal plate area that's right above the triggers. I don't know if this is specifically to address heat dissipation or something like that, but I kind of like that it helps it feel pretty premium. At the bottom is where we'll find our USB-C port for charging, a microSD card slot, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. On the right side is our teal power button and a switch that can be customized in settings. On the left side of the device is volume up and volume down. Some other specs that are packed into the TrimUI Brick include 1GB of RAM, Wi-Fi support, Bluetooth support, and a 3000 mAh battery. The TrimUI Brick is available in white, black, red, and purple. Black and white are easy to get right now, and the red and purple seem to be on back order, so it might take a while to get those back in stock. The price of the TrimUI Brick seems to vary pretty wildly. From Powkitty, you can pick up the TrimUI Brick starting at $65, but stock seems fairly limited and even on back order for some options. 2 Retro is another online shop that sells emulation handhelds. They actually sent me one of these TrimUI Bricks. They're offering the base model for $80 and with free shipping. They do have a referral program that will get you an additional 10% off, and you can use the code SCATTEREDBRAIN if you're interested. But you can actually get an even better deal. They're offering 20% off by using their discount code straight on their website. The AliExpress listing starts around $60, but you might find shipping times to be less than ideal. Keep in mind that the base model of the TrimUI Brick comes with no microSD card. This means that even the firmware is not installed. This means that you would normally need to scour the internet through cryptic instructions to find out what needs to actually go on that microSD card. But I'll show you a quick way to get a new microSD card up and going, but it does require the extra step of some setup on your computer. So if you're looking for an unbox and game experience, you'll definitely want to make sure you get a microSD card included with your device. That will increase the price of the TrimUI Brick, but it may be worth it depending on your tinkering tolerance. Most sites are offering 64GB or 128GB microSD cards for a little bit of an extra cost. When it comes to software on the TrimUI Brick, the StockOS definitely leaves a lot to be desired. There's a custom firmware on the horizon called CrossMix, which lives on top of TrimUI StockOS, and that will certainly improve the state of the firmware, but for what we currently have now, it's incredibly convoluted. I feel like navigating is incredibly unclear, and I end up just button mashing to try to figure out what button's gonna do what. If you picked up a TrimUI Brick that includes a microSD card, it will also most likely come preloaded with tons of ROMs. My stance remains that I'd rather a device just not come with ROMs at all, but it does feel like a necessity for the TrimUI Brick, considering without the microSD card, there's quite a bit more setup you need to go through. Seemingly also included on the preloaded microSD card are a handful of PC ports. It is pretty uncool to just load up PC games that are clearly pirated, but on the other hand, it's pretty great to be able to just play some Balatro on this super portable device. If you don't own Balatro, buy it. If you do opt to get the device without a microSD card, I do have something cool to show you. If you use the link in the description of this video to my GitHub, I have a script that you can run from PowerShell on Windows. I'm working on a Mac and Linux compatible version, but that's still in progress. So for now, Windows only. The only other prerequisite for this script is to have 7-zip installed. Just put a blank microSD card into your computer and take note of what drive it is. Then, copy and paste the single line command from GitHub into PowerShell. The script will ask you what drive to copy the files to. Just type in that drive that we looked at earlier without hitting the trailing backslash and hit enter. This process will take around 20 minutes, but at least we've got a progress bar to show us how far along we are. This will copy all the required files to your microSD card, and then the next step for you is to just drag and drop some ROMs onto that microSD card and get gaming. A feature of the TrimUI Brick that I was pretty intrigued by is NetPlay. My results were kind of hit or miss. I thought that NetPlay being an option here would streamline multiplayer, but this really seems to just be an extra layer on top of RetroArch's NetPlay solution. This means that NetPlay is really only meant for games that support couch multiplayer, so games like NBA Jam or Super Mario Kart. This means that Game Boy link cable features are out of the question. Customization on the stock firmware is a bit limited. The settings include a toggle to turn NetPlay on or off, set up a local hotspot so you can do NetPlay without an available Wi-Fi network, and toggling different USB modes. Under the Apps section, there are some more nuanced settings though. Through the Apps section, you can set up your function keys and launch RetroArch so you can change global settings. Even though I'm not really a big fan of the StockOS, something I really like a lot is how they simplified the in-game menus. When you're in a game and hit the menu button, you get a super simplified menu. It has easy access to save and load states, a quick shortcut to get you into NetPlay, and the option to quickly exit out of your game. This is just a layer on top of RetroArch, so if you want RetroArch's menus, you can just select Advanced Menu, which will bring you into that familiar interface. Out of the box, the StockOS has support for tons of emulators. That includes Dreamcast, PlayStation 1, N64, Nintendo DS, and even PSP. But just because it supports it, it doesn't mean that every game will play well though. But we'll be sure to check out everything and see how games play. If you aren't tied to getting those higher end systems up and running, my favorite custom firmware is available for the TrimUI Brick, MinUI. This firmware not only looks fantastic, but it's incredibly easy to use. Also, it's a huge plus that this actually makes this device look even more similar to the Analogue Pocket. MinUI supports emulators up to PlayStation 1, so no Dreamcast, N64, PSP, or Nintendo DS. But the end result is just the absolute cleanest UI with a focus on just getting you right into a game. I definitely recommend checking out this firmware. There are also some other custom firmware options that could be great to check out too. There's Nully, which is a fork of Batocera, and I'm glad to see that it's available for the TrimUI Brick. There is one more firmware, although it's not quite available yet. I mentioned it earlier and it's called CrossMix. CrossMix is the firmware that was available on the TrimUI Smart Pro. The dev is actively working on adding in TrimUI Brick support, but it's not available to use just yet. For gaming performance, we're going to look at gaming on the stock default OS. Systems like NES and Genesis perform great. And it's also worth calling out just how great the screen is on the TrimUI Brick. The higher resolution IPS screen really makes games pop, and the 4:3 aspect ratio really shows off how minimal the bezels are on the TrimUI Brick. Super Nintendo also performs pretty well out of the box. Even though I found that harder to emulate Super Nintendo games play at full speed, I have noticed that some games have like some glitching and stuttering, but nothing I'd say that's totally game breaking. Game Boy and Game Boy Color are great on the Brick, and because of the form factor, they felt right at home on this device. Game Boy Advance is also great on the TrimUI Brick, but since the aspect ratio is a bit wider, you do have some letterboxing. By default, integer scaling is turned on. This will make sure that the upscale won't distort any visuals, but if you're not too concerned about being a purist, you can disable integer scaling and reduce the bezels even more. PlayStation 1 is just about the top end of what we can expect to get out of the TrimUI Brick, where any game I tried out performed great. Since PlayStation games run at a 4:3 aspect ratio, games take up the full available space of the screen and look fantastic. While we can get N64 games up and running, you'll notice that we're missing some key buttons, like a C stick and an analog stick. The D-pad is mapped to the analog stick, so you can at least get some games up and running. Game performance does seem like it's alright, but as far as playability, you'll have to pick out games that don't really rely on the C stick or the D-pad. PSP is another example of a system that's supported, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience is going to be good. By default, the PSP emulator is set to a 2x upscale, but that's just not really an option for us. Wipeout doesn't run at full speed, even when we reduce the resolution. But if you don't mind sacrificing some frames, you can turn on frame skip and get at least a little bit more stable gameplay. There are less graphically demanding PSP games you can get up and running. The included games on the microSD card had this game called The 2D Adventures of Rotating Octopus Character. It's one of those PSP mini games, but it's actually pretty fun, and since it's so graphically simple, it runs great on the TrimUI Brick. Nintendo DS is an interesting system here. The emulation is through Drastic, which is a great emulator, but it's just a hassle to figure out using the stylus. The screens are also displayed on the wrong sides. The bottom screen is the larger screen by default, so I had to change that in Drastic settings, so take out your magnifying glass. Once you do swap the screens and settings, if you can find some games that don't need any touchscreen features, I did find that DS runs some games pretty well. Lastly, we'll take a look at Dreamcast. It seems like there's a frame skip, but to be honest, I'm pretty impressed with the performance. Crazy Taxi plays pretty well, but it's far from comfortable to control. Playing Dreamcast is the only time I also noticed that the device does get a bit warm, specifically around the metal plate area right above the trigger buttons. It's not an uncomfortable amount of heat or anything like that, but I figured it's worth calling out. The TrimUI Brick might not have feature-packed firmware like the Miyoo Mini or the Miyoo Mini Plus, but the Brick offers a really high-quality built handheld. I love the micro switch buttons and D-pad, the concept of being able to hot swap the triggers to different styles, and yeah, this screen is just awesome. Compared to the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus, the TrimUI Brick is just way more ergonomic. I really like that the buttons are a bit higher on the device. Even though the stock firmware on the Brick is kind of a drag, it does offer a pretty extensive list of systems it can emulate, including PC ports, even though how they got the PC ports are certainly questionable. What really sold me on enjoying the TrimUI Brick so much is the fact that MinUI is available for this device. This firmware just immediately makes the Brick so much more enjoyable to use. I love that the TrimUI Brick feels like a budget mini Analogue Pocket. The RGB on so many areas of the device is a bit too much sometimes, but I appreciate that the RGB can at least be turned off. The function buttons don't quite have as much customization as I would have liked to see, but in reality, I'm not really using them much anyways. Before the TrimUI Brick, the Miyoo Mini was my go-to device. I loved just throwing it in a bag, but now that I've experienced the TrimUI Brick, it's actually going to replace my Miyoo Mini. I just think it's a much more comfortable device, and I really like that high pixel density screen. I find it to be such an enjoyable handheld gaming experience, and I can't wait to see how the community and devs continue to push this device forward. But what do you think of the TrimUI Brick? Are you planning on picking one up? Are you sticking to a different vertical handheld? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I've got links to the different shops that have the TrimUI Brick available, and those links directly support the channel. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and thanks for watching!